Hi, welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John.
Hello.
And Hannah. And today we're going to be talking about inventories and equipment in RPGs. So, John.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've done quite a few roleplay games between us.
Yeah, I've played one or two at a time.
And I'm assuming that most of the people that are listening are familiar with how equipment works in D&D. I.e., you have a page on your character sheet where you have a list of all the stuff your character's carrying. And depending on how strict your GM is, that can equate to effectively a van full of stuff, or it can be a strict limit set according to how strong your character.
Yeah, I mean, I think inventory lists and encumbrance, which for anyone who's not aware, is the name often used for how you get slowed down by the weight of your equipment and stuff like that. I think it's one of the most often sort of like fudged / house rules / just flat out ignored bits in the game.
Indeed.
Because, I mean, let's face it, totting up all these encumbrance things and then sort of like trying to work out, that minuses me 5 movement and my dex is... It's not particularly interesting. I mean, if you think about D&D, and obviously originally it wasn't meant to emulate sort of fantasy films, but that tends to be more how it's gone sort of nowadays. You know, it emulates a particular genre. And if you think about it, when you ever see a film where they're like, let's go and fight that dragon, and they're like, I forgot to pack a spare dagger, or like, I forgot my backpack.
How often do you see a film where somebody's given a MacGuffin in Act 1 and it comes up useful in Act 3?
That's true, but that's like a plot element. I'd classify that as like a treasure rather than just basic equipment. I mean, you very rarely see a bit when they're like, right, we're going to go and fight the dragon. However, first we've got to spend half an hour of the film at the local like corner shop, like buying swords and 10-foot poles and stuff like that.
Indeed, and a lot of D&D can like devolve into that.
Yeah.
Now, at the other extreme, you've got something like my Fate game, where it's the Star Trek universe, therefore everybody's got access to a replicator.
Yeah, it's post-scarcity, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's completely irrelevant how much money you've got. You can just walk up to a machine and ask for something. And if it's something that machine can't make, then you still don't have to put that much effort in unless I choose to make it difficult for you to get something.
Well, we should, sorry to go on a random tangent, we should do an episode where we talk about like Star Trek technology and like modern technology. I know, I'm sure everyone out there knows that like Star Trek, the original series, influenced a lot of modern technology from like the flip phones to stuff like that. But when you think about things like replicators, and then you think, well, we've got 3D printers now, so...
I think Isaac Arthur's probably got us beat on that. He's done 2 or 3 episodes and he actually knows what he's talking about.
Well, yeah, but I mean, obviously Isaac Arthur is like amazing in terms of the science stuff. And
watch Isaac Arthur's YouTube if you're running a sci-fi game, people.
What's the name of it? Is that Futurism with Isaac Arthur or something like that?
SFIA, Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur.
Definitely going to listen to that if you're into like your sci-fi, you want to hear some cool stuff about science. Great channel. But I mean, in terms of like role-play stuff, I think we could talk a bit about that and sort of how you can extend and extrapolate what we've got now to make convincing sort of future thing. But obviously we're getting off track. We're talking about inventories.
I do kind of feel like you're trying to distract me from the inventories with talk of Star Trek, because you know I fucking love Star Trek.
Well, why would I want to distract you?
But anyway, so in between those two extremes, you've got a system that works really, really well for the equipment stuff, and that's the main reason I was suggesting doing this episode, because we've been playing this system and we've played Scum and Villainy, and we're currently playing Band of Blades.
That's correct.
And do you want to explain a bit about the system? How the equipment stuff works in the system.
So basically, I'm going to give you a very, very brief explanation of the sort of overview of Band of Blades, because it informs how the inventory system works. But I'm not going to go into too much detail. We did a session 0 recording, so you can check that out if you want to find out more about Band of Blades. But essentially, it's a sort of dark military fantasy dealia where you play the sort of higher-ups, the leaders, the decision-makers of the human forces fighting against this undead like Lich King called the Cinder King. And unfortunately, the human armies have already been beat. The final battle has already been lost. You are now in a retreat, trying to desperately get to a place called Skydagger Keep and make your final stand. Now, as well as playing those sort of high up decision makers, when you send people off on a mission to like get resources or weapons or whatever, you choose which of the men from your force are going to go on the mission, and you then take their part to play the mission. And the reason that's relevant in terms of inventory is because every time you go on a mission, you get to pick what's called a load for the character that you're playing. And this is basically the list of equipment they have for a game. And it's classified in 3 different ways. Now, you can either take a light load, a normal load, or a heavy load. Now, if you take a light load, you'll get a certain amount of equipment, and you might get 1 or 2 little choices, but you get like a finite amount of equipment, normally 3 to 4 sort of items. If you take a normal load, you get all of that stuff and some extra stuff, with the understanding that you're not as fast moving, you're a bit weighed down, you're a bit less stealthy. If you take a heavy load, that's when like start to get real, and you're going strapped up with all your weapons. You've got armour, you've got muskets, you've got all the stuff off the light and the normal loads, and you've got a load of extra shizzle off the heavy loads. But you are armed to the teeth. You are not stealthy by any means. You are slow moving, so you are trading out speed and flexibility for the hitting power. In addition to that, whatever load you select, you also get what's called the utility load, where you get to select a couple of items from a little list, and that just rounds off your equipment choice and gives you a little bit of personalisation. So that's how it works for Band of Blades. And one of the reasons I personally quite like this is because there's still a bit of flexibility, because you get to pick your load individually. So one person might go, oh, I'm the scout for this mission, I'll take a light load so I can move quickly. And one person might go, right, I'm the heavy, I'm for when stuff goes wrong, I'm going to take a heavy load. So you've got a bit of flexibility, but you don't have to spend a long time selecting all your stuff. You pick light, medium or heavy load, you choose a couple of little extra bits, boom, done.
Exactly.
And all the equipment's already sort of flavoured around the speciality of that character. So if you play a heavy, you'll have different equipment options to a medic. And I think that's one of the reasons why it works in Band of Blades, because all of the characters have a strong theme.
And the equipment lists in Scum and Villainy work very similarly, but you choose how much stuff you're bringing, but not what stuff.
Yeah.
And each character type has their own list from which you can pick certain stuff that will add to your load. There will also be certain things on that list that are in italics, so they don't add to your encumbrance.
Yeah, so the way it works in Scum and Villainy, as Hannah was saying, again, you select whether you're going for like a light, medium or heavy load, with all the sort of upsides and downsides that brings. However, unlike Band of Blades, where because your resources, the equipment that the Legion, your army has, is a big thing in Band of Blades. However, in Scum and Villainy, you don't pick your equipment straight off. You pick a light load, and it'll say you've got this many boxes of equipment, and then there'll be a list of stuff you could potentially have with like boxes next to them. And during the course of a mission, you might be like, oh right, I need to shoot someone, so I'm going to tick this one box here to say that I've got a blaster pistol as part of my equipment. But once you've ticked it, that is set. It is then part of your equipment. But as long as you've got boxes that are unfilled, the number of boxes being based on the load you've taken, then you can select equipment as the situation merits it from this list. So it's very flexible.
There's another system that we've played quite a bit that handles equipment very differently.
Okay.
Go on, tell us about World of Darkness and how equipment's handled in that.
In World of Darkness games, you might have defined equipment, like, if you steal a policeman's badge in an adventure, you've got a policeman's badge. But at the start of the game, you tend to have backgrounds such as resources representing how much cash you've got. You might have a haven background representing the building you live in. And they're sort of abstract measures of stuff that you can get hold of easily. So if you've got a high level of resources you need to buy a car, you might be able to just whoop out your wallet or your credit card and be like, boom, I've bought that car. Whereas if you've got a low level of resources, you're going to have to come up with some cunning plan or some ridiculous way of getting enough money to get this car, or to be honest, you're probably just going to nick it.
Because you're a vampire.
Exactly.
So, different sorts of games, different sorts of player groups are gonna like or dislike these sort of different things.
Well, I think part of it comes down to sort of how much you want the game to be a sort of a simulation. Because obviously, if you want the game to be, we know that no game's going to exactly replicate reality. That's ridiculous, obviously. But if you want a game that goes to more effort to try and replicate something resembling reality, then you're probably going to want to keep in mind the fact that, if you're carrying carrying like a wardrobe and you've got a table and you've got a 10-foot pole and you've got a broadsword, then you're going to struggle to move, much less do anything else. And you'll probably want to have that represented. Whereas if you just want to play a fantasy game where you're kicking ass, you're taking names, you're probably not going to be so bothered about that. But I think most people probably fall somewhere in the middle. So for me, I don't want personally, for my game, I don't want the sort of shopping sessions you tend to get and the extra resource management that goes into like tracking all of this stuff to the nth degree. However, I also don't want someone going like, oh, well, I'm wearing full plate armour, I'm carrying 6 backpacks laden down with coins, I'm carrying a halberd, I've got a 10-foot pole, I've got this, that and the other. But I just tend to go with a bit of common sense. If someone's got far too much stuff on them, I will just say to them, you cannot carry any more, or you are going to struggle to do whatever the action is based on what they're carrying.
For myself,
yeah,
I'm quite happy to completely not bother with the inventory stuff. But it got me thinking today, maybe I should sort of keep track of a few things like that. I don't think it's really so relevant in the game I'm
Well, yeah,
running.
I mean, I can certainly see your logic. I mean, you're saying Star Trek, it's a post-scarcity world. In the normal course of situations, like if you're not trapped or anything or confined, then you can just go up to a replicator and go, replicator, give me a 10-foot pole. Brrr, out it comes. No problems. But maybe if you want to, I was going to suggest maybe if you want to dip your toe in the water of that, how about if you ran an adventure where they were maybe stranded somewhere and they've not got access to those resources? Maybe there's a shuttle crash.
This may actually be the reason that the idea came into my head.
Well, there you go, you see. Maybe there's a shuttle crash and you can say to them at the start, right, you can pick X number of items that were on the shuttlecraft, let them define that and then say, right, shuttlecraft crashes, that's what you've got, and they have to make do with what they've got. I mean, you could even tell them to say they're going on an away mission. I mean, I don't know the specifics, but say they're going on an away mission and you're like, right, here's a list of things, pick, let's say 15 for a random number, pick 15 things off here, that's what's on your shuttlecraft. Don't tell them what the adventure's going to be. Then halfway through, red alert, shuttle's crashed. You can then say, you've only got these 15 things. That's literally all you've got. You haven't got any replicators, the ship's power's down. What are you going to do about it?
However, when I'm running fantasy games, it's obviously a lot more of an important factor. It's the sort of thing that is quite useful, and something that I was thinking about with fantasy games like D&D is having the group at the start of the campaign basically come up with a backpack, which is somebody's got the backpack, it's brought with you, and it has the equipment that isn't your bedrolls or your food.
Yeah.
You agree that between you at the start of your campaign, you're pulling out a book. I assume somebody else has already got this idea.
No. I'm just pulling out the book that I think might be an interesting sort of look at it, but I'm just refreshing my memory.
Yeah, you basically come up with the equipment that you've got for your adventuring group, and if people want to add to it, they can. But it does sort of bypass this equipment thing that happens at the start of a lot of adventures in D&D. If you've already done it in the first adventure and just said, yeah, that's your equipment, unless you get an opportunity to buy more stuff, there's none of this trawling through books and stuff that I remember, which maybe doesn't happen so much in 5th Ed, but I remember being a big part of 2nd Ed. So come on then, what's in the black hack that you're going to tell me about?
Okay, so on the black hack you get very simple character sheets. It's got an inventory of 20 items, that's what you can carry. Simple as. Now, the way another sort of OSR game, Lamentations of the Flame Princess, works is, again, you have a certain number of slots on your inventory. Some items are classified as oversized items, like double-handed weapons, and they take up 2 slots instead of 1. Some items are classified as tiny items, so a dot, and 10 dots would take up an item. And the way that works is it's very easy.
Why does that sound like the equipment system for Munchkin?
I wouldn't know.
The Munchkin card game.
I wouldn't know, sweetie.
No, right.
But the way that works is very simple, because you fill up your slots on your inventory, you then count up the number of things you've got in your inventory, and then you use that to determine what the effect is on your movement and stuff like that. So it's taking the basic sort of D&D idea, but it's simplifying it a bit, because you don't have to look at the individual encumbrance for each item. You just go, oh, I've got this many slots filled, right, my movement's reduced by like 5 or whatever.
Nice.
So I quite like that as a sort of in-between measure, where it gives you a bit of a flavour of it, but the actual bookkeeping bit is fairly easy to do.
Another aspect of this, of course, is how powerful characters are.
Yeah.
And I suppose one of the big reasons that everybody has access to everything in the game I'm running is because a big part of that game is, hey, you've got all the power, you can nuke this planet from orbit if you choose to. What are you going to do? Whereas a lot of games are about being the people at the bottom and struggling your way up.
Yeah.
And if your character's got nothing but literally his boots and his father's sword, then the next piece of equipment that you get hold of is a lot more important to you than when you're at like 20th level and you've got vaults of gold and you're dolled up to the nines in 20 different suits of armour because you can.
Yeah.
And you've got access to palaces and stuff. It doesn't matter so much. So at a lower level, it's obviously a lot more important to do the inventory thing to some degree, to talk about like what equipment you have and haven't got access to, because it helps keep the like power creep down.
Yeah, that's true. It's true.
Go on, you pulled another book out. What are you digging?
Yeah, it's ICRPG. I was seeing if I could find what it lists in terms of like the maximum amount of equipment you can have. But I can't actually see anything about it. No, I believe ICRPG, again, it's just the number of slots on your character sheet. And the thing about ICRPG is, I mean, it's loosely based on like D20, D&D, but rather than advance by gaining XP and extra abilities, you tend to advance by like gaining loot, items which alter your abilities or give you extra stuff. So obviously what you carry becomes quite important in that game, because you have to sort of juggle things around to try and get the bonuses or whatever that you want. So, but you can still only carry a limited amount of them. So in this, because you're like, you might be like, oh, let's say you can only carry 10 items. You might be like, oh, I've got 5 which give you the bonuses, which like power me up, but that only leaves you like 5 slots free for carrying actual equipment. Now, don't get me wrong, like a ring that gives you like +2 strength is amazing, but if you find yourself in like a dungeon and you're like, oh, I left my rope and my lantern at home because I need to carry this ring of strength, all the strength in the world's not going to help you when you're like trying to cross like a 60-foot chasm in the dark. So it's nice because it makes it important that you sort of pay attention to it, but again, it's still very simple. Pretty much everything takes up 1 slot. You've got so many slots you can use. If you want more than that, you need to buy a cart or get a hireling or something else like that. I mean, one of the few advantages that mages have in the game is some of their spells that they memorise don't count as items, whereas most other stuff does. So you can carry quite a bit as the mage and still have some spells. So they get like an additional benefit in the fact that like you need a bit of extra equipment carrying. The mage has probably got space for it.
I suppose we can't really talk about equipment and inventories without talking about the like obligatory henchman strapped down with half a dozen backpacks and a chest on his back, you know, Nodwick.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's going back a bit. But yeah, obviously one of the reasons for hiring henchmen, as well as having like extra bods in combat and stuff like that, is purely so you can carry more loot. Especially, I mean, it'd be quite anticlimactic if you fought your way through to like the centre of a dungeon. We're like, great, we've defeated the evil warlord, we can now claim his treasure. And you're saying like, oh, we can only carry like 2 bits of it back with us because like, we're too loaded down. Then you're like, oh, I mean, it could be quite interesting, because then you'd be like, oh, we might have to fight our way out, so what do we keep and what do we drop so we can carry more treasure? But obviously that's why you take hirelings, so you can just be like, right, grab hold of that treasure chest, let's go.
So, anything else you want to say about equipment or inventories?
No, I mean, like I said at the start, the only one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of extensive inventory things is because you tend to, and I'm not saying every player does this, but we've all had those players where you start off a session and you're like, right, great, there's an exciting adventure coming up. Right, you're heading to the Dungeon of Deadly Doom to take on the Dread Demi-Lich. And everyone else is like, yeah, let's go, let's get in there and let's kick his ass. And then you always have the one player who's like,
actually, I'd like to go and buy some equipment first, if you don't mind.
And you're like, okay, no problems. You want to buy some equipment? What do you want to buy? Thinking, oh, maybe they're going to grab a sword and a few bits and pieces. And they're like,
oh, is there a shop that sells candles and prayer beads?
And you're like, yeah, there is. What do you want to buy? And then they insist on haggling with the shopkeeper. They insist on shopping around for the best price. And the sort of shopping trip, as I like to call it, almost becomes an end unto itself. And hell, I don't even like shopping in real life. Never mind imaginary shopping for imaginary sure. And I have never, well, yeah, do you know what? I'll put it out there. I've never been in a game or GM'd a game where someone who has spent hours doing their shopping for their equipment has saved the day with any of the equipment they've got. Because generically, if you're going into a dungeon in a D&D fantasy, you need some rope, you need some lanterns, you need some oil, maybe a spade. Happy days. Done. That's what you need. Anything extra is nice, but it's mainly just for flavour. So, I mean, I had this happen in one of my games a couple of years ago now, where we were going to start off a session, and because we had a guy who was into the equipment, I said, right, before we get to the session, if you want to buy any equipment, you know how much gold you've got. Equipment, we're playing Lamentations of the Flame Prince, as I mentioned earlier. I was like, if you want to buy any of the equipment, we've all got the book. Equipment costs are in there. Mate, if you want to buy stuff, you've got access to Roll20. Just take the money off your character sheet, put the equipment on your character sheet, and then we're going to start the game as soon as we get started. So we kicked off the game, and literally the first thing the guy said is like,
oh, there's still a few bits of equipment I need to sort out.
And one of the other bits was Johannes, actually. About blew his stack. He was just like,
no, that's why John said, make sure you've got your equipment before the session, so we don't have to do this short, and we can get straight to the game.
I can't remember if he said it short, but that was the brunt of it. And
it's the kind of thing I can see him saying.
And the main problem with this, because don't get me wrong, if there's nothing exciting going on in the game and you're like, oh, I want to do a bit of shopping, that's fine, I don't mind that, whatever. Maybe you're coming back from an adventure and you're like, I want to spend my hard-earned gold, that's fine, no worries. But the fact is, especially at the start, if you're the GM and you're trying to get everyone ramped up, you're trying to get everyone excited, so there's a bit of passion and investment in yes, we're going on this adventure, we're all enthusiastic, we're going for it. There is nothing that will kill that enthusiasm more stone dead than someone going,
oh, can we spend half an hour going around the shops and haggling over fictitious goods?
That will just stop any build-up that you're trying to do for your adventure and throw cold water over it. So then by the time that I'm using half an hour just as a random example, sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter, but once that shopping trip is done, most of the other players who couldn't give a shit about buying whatever are all then just sat around
yeah,
because they're thoroughly disengaged because of that shopping trip. So you've then got to start at square one, getting them built up again, ready for the game. So it's just effectively wasted that work you put in at the start of the session. Now, if someone at the very start of the session said, oh, can I buy a bit of equipment? And you say, oh yeah, here's an equipment, let's buy what you want. And they're just like, oh yeah, I'm going to buy this, this and this, and it's done. That's grand. It's the extended shopping scene that I have a problem with. And to be honest, when people try it now in my game, I'm just like, no, that isn't happening.
Okay, so the shopping scene.
Dunk!
I have seen people make use of it and make good use of that time for roleplay for the other players who aren't going through the books and being tedious, to get in perhaps a scene with somebody trying to pick their pocket, and that brings you into the local thieves guild. A scene with just chatting to the merchant and getting some tips on whatever adventure they're headed to.
Yeah,
anything that, it can be put to good use.
Like anything, it's very sort of situation dependent. Because like I say, if you're in a phase where everyone's got the idea that oh, we've got a bit of time before the adventure, let's go and talk to some NPCs, let's find out a bit of information, and let's do this, that and the other. That's grand because everyone knows what the score is with that. And if you want to do a bit of socialising and whatever, then that is absolutely grand, no problem with that. It enriches the world. Great, happy days. I've had that happen. I've had that done quite a lot in various games I've run. My issue is when you sort of get to the stage where you're like, right, let's go for the mission now, and then someone goes, oh, actually.
Yeah,
it's that, oh, actually.
Yeah, I think we can agree that is a problem.
Yeah.
The other problem that I've come up against with the whole equipment inventory thing is at the other end of the game when there's this huge list of what you've found in the dungeon, and you have to spend an hour of admin time basically splitting it up between the group. And again, this is something where keeping it much simpler or not having loot be the sort of target of the game just sort of bypasses that. But there are other ways around it. So like, again, you're running a D&D game, 10th level say, and they've just finished a 6-session dungeon. Now you're going to have some decent loot at the end of that. How would you handle not turning the next hour of gameplay into basically just somebody reading out a list and somebody going, oh, I want that, and then somebody else going, oh, but I want that, but I want that, but I want that.
I would hand a ready-made list over to whoever the spokesperson is for the party, so whoever the party leader is. I'll be like, you have found, I give them a brief description, I'm like, you have found this, here is the list. And obviously, because I run games online, it's quite easy for me to go, here's a list in the chat box or whatever. Now, most of my players are pretty good, and they'll generally be like, because they know I'm not too fussed about the encumbrance, as long as it's not ridiculous. So quite often they'll be like, oh, we take the treasure, we'll work out exactly how we're going to split it up afterwards. And I go, that's grand, I know you split it between you somehow, you're all going to be together, that's fine, and I don't ask any questions. Then later on after the game, they can be like, all right, the barbarian will be better with the +1 sword, and and they can sort it all out then after the game. If I had players who maybe weren't sort of along that lines, I mean, like I said, I'm blessed with quite cool players. If I had players who maybe wanted to do that whole like, oh, well, who's going to do this, who's going to do that, and they thought it was a good idea in the middle of a dangerous dungeon to like start poring over equipment and taking their time and loudly debating what equipment they were going to have, I'd just be sat there rolling a d6 and be like, oh, that wandering monster's going to come along sooner or later.
Fair enough.
Or if I really wanted to make the point with sort of sledgehammer subtlety, I'd be like, oh, you've defeated the villain. Oh, his lair's starting to collapse. Oh, the ceiling's collapsing. Oh, the roof's falling around you. Oh, well, yeah, you can stand it if you want, but like every turn I'm going to roll a d6. I want to get a 1. One of you's going to be hit by a giant rock. And if that doesn't get the point across, nothing will. But the fact is, I mean, obviously that's not a subtle example, but the fact is, if normally in a D&D game, if you're in a dungeon, pretty much every other round, the GM's rolling like a d6 and you've got like a 1 in 6 chance for a wandering monster to turn up. Now, if you think that a combat round represents like, what, 10, 20, 30 seconds maybe? I can't remember the exact amount of time. I'm sure someone out there will know. But if they're stood there having a conversation for a number of minutes, how many wandering monster rolls is that going to be? And I don't time it exactly. I just sit there and like every like 10 or so seconds, I'll be like, roll the dice, roll the dice, roll the dice. And eventually you'll get a 1 and some more monsters will turn up. Now, they might deal with those monsters, but you can bet that after a couple of times that's happened, they'll be like, maybe we should talk about this back at the inn rather than like in the middle of the Temple of Deadly Doom.
So, anything else you want to say about inventories?
No, I'm pretty good, I think.
Marvellous.
So that's it for this episode about inventories. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you want to get in touch with us, you can leave us a voicemail message using SpeakPipe. There's a link in the description. Or you can send us a voicemail message to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and happy gaming.
Bye. What have you got to say to the internet today? Yeah, anything else? No, okay then.